I'll begin by saying where we are in our life is not where we ever expected to be. I did not think that I turned 40 this year, that at 40 I would be a father to 10 kids and living in South Dallas. That was not my life plan. So I'll begin by that. My life plan, and the one that I thought the Lord was leading me to, when I was end of college or in beginning of college, the Lord had really worked in my heart when I was in high school to consider how I would make my profession be something that could be applicable in terms of being able to share my faith and to be able to use it practically. And so all throughout college, I thought the Lord was calling me to medical missions, and that's really what we had planned for. And so that's how actually I met my wife. My wife Melissa and I actually met on the mission field. I was working as a kind of an assistant in a hospital in rural India, and my wife was the house mother in an orphanage. And so a bunch of her six kids got sick, and so that's how we met and fell in love and got married. And one of the big reasons why we connected was because we both had a heart for missions. And so that's really what we felt the Lord was leading us to, and that's what we had planned on. And so I did my undergrad at A&M, was a teacher for a little bit. I taught high school chemistry in South Dallas, and then after that I did my training at the Mayo Clinic, and I got my MD there. And all the while still praying about where we'd go long term. And the Lord, I'm from India, that's where I grew up. And so I really felt like the Lord was calling us to go back to India because we felt like that was a huge need for good medical care, but also for the gospel. And we thought, oh, this would be a great way to meld those two things together. And so that's what we prayed about, and that's where the Lord was continuing to lead. And so after I finished my medical school, Melissa and I moved down here with our two oldest kids, so Karna and Luke at that point. And then soon after Vivek came, and so I did my emergency medicine residency here at Southwestern. And then God continued to lead us, and then so we ended up going to work at a mission hospital on the border of India and Nepal. And that's really where I thought our career would be as missionaries working at this mission hospital. So we moved to India in 2013. So that was me and Melissa and our oldest three kids. And when we got there, the Lord moved us to a place near the Himalayan foothills in a place called Uttarakhand. We learned language study there, to learn how to speak Hindi, because that was the language we spoken at the hospital. And then we moved to kind of the poorest part of India, is a state called Bihar. And so we moved there to work at the hospital. So I managed the emergency department, the ICU there. It was about a 220 bed hospital. And on average, we saw a little bit over 120,000 patients a year. And then we were the only ICU level facility for about 11 million people. So anybody that was sick within about an 8-hour region would refer their patients to us. And so many times when my ICU was full and I ran out of ventilators and I told them, look, I can't take care of you, the nearest hospital that could do what we could do was about 8 hours away. And so most of the time when I told them that, it would just mean they would take them home to die because there was no other place to go. So that's where we worked, and it was very fruitful. I really, both me and Melissa really had a heart for discipleship, and that's really where we thought God had gifted us. And so we started off with initially about 3 or 4 residents. By the time we left India, we were like 15 residents that we were training a year, mentoring, discipling them, which really was kind of where we thought long term how we're going to make a change in India is to disciple young people and give them a heart for missions, and then see how they could use their faith practically. So that was our long term plan, and the Lord was blessing that. We had one of our friends join us there and became a church planter there, and he was able to establish multiple churches during the time that we were there, and just continued that work. And really, we thought that's where the Lord was leading, and that's where He was blessing the work. And so, in 2016, I teach for the CMDA, so we travel internationally to go teach for that conference. And so, in April of that year, our whole family went to go teach at a conference in Greece. But as we left the country, my family cleared immigration fine, but then as soon as they came to my departing the country, they stopped me, and then they said, hey, if I were you, I would never come back to this country again. And I said, what do you mean? Like, I was born here, I was an Indian citizen, I had a dual citizenship. And they said, well, we can't tell you, but if I were you, I wouldn't come back to this country. I said, oh, that's a very strange warning. So then we were in Europe doing this conference all the time, knowing, what does this mean? Like, can we go back there or not? And so lots of praying, lots of questioning about what the Lord, but we said, well, we have to know and we have to find out. And so at the beginning of May, is it end of April, beginning of May? I can't remember. end of April in 2016, we returned back to India. So Melissa and the kids went through first. We knew that they didn't have any issues, so they went through without any difficulty. And then I went back to the immigration counter, gave my passport, and then you could see these red lights are flashing on the screen. And then suddenly it's like 1, then 3, then like 5 officers come. And then they're all looking at my files, and they're like, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I am a doctor. I work as an emergency physician. I manage an ICU." And they said, "Well, what are you really doing here?" And I said, "Well, I take care of patients at this hospital, and what else? I don't know what else I do." And we've lived here for 3 years. Our family's here. Our home is here. They said, "Well, the Indian government has ordered your deportation, and you're no longer welcome in the country. You have an hour to leave this country." And I said, "What do you mean? Like my whole life is here, my family's here, the people that I train, the hospital that I work at is here." I said, "No, the order's been issued. You're no longer welcome in the country. You have an hour leave." So we had flown from Turkey, and so they actually kept the flight waiting, and they would not let the flight depart until they put me back on the airplane. And so then it was an extremely traumatic event for my kids to see me being taken into custody. So then I got escorted by a bunch of guards and then put back on this plane. And then Melissa and the kids were left in India at that point. I had no idea when they would see them again. So get on this plane. As I leave India, I'm looking behind, and just lots of questions about, "Lord, like I followed you where you asked me to go. This is clearly where you were leading. You were blessing our work. Why are you making us go through this? Like, this makes no sense at all." And lots of questions about whether I would ever see my homeland again. But all I knew was that I had to trust that the Lord was still in control. So anyway, I got deported from India to Turkey, because that's where I'd flown from. And then actually I started my trip in Spain. So I thought I could get out of the airport when I got to Turkey, because Turkey has visa on arrival. But then I got to Turkey and then let everybody off the plane, but they wouldn't let me off. And I said, "Well, what's going on?" They said, "Well, because you're deported, you have to go back to where you started. So you can't get off the airplane until the Turkish authorities come get you." So then 2 Turkish police officers come on the plane. They take me to detention. Then I go spend the next 24 hours in a detention cell in Istanbul. And so I then get separated from everybody else. I have no papers at this point. All my documents are taken away. So I spent 24 hours there in custody, and then get deported to Spain, which is where I started my journey. And then Spanish authorities were like, "What's wrong with you, man? Like, why are you here?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't know why I'm here either." And they're like, "Well, you have permission to be on Spanish territory, so you can get off here." I said, "Okay, great." And so we had some friends there that picked me up in the airport. And then all this time, Melissa is there. And Melissa has the tough job now trying to wind up our life in India with 3 kids and trying to figure out what to do. Do you want to tell a little bit of what you did in India before we came back?
Relations between the U.S. and India had deteriorated over the prior 3 years, and so they not only said they would not help us, they said, "Actually, it's better for you that we do not get involved. We would be a detriment to you winning this case." So then I went to the hotel and cried. But then the ADF attorneys, they were like, "Okay, we're ready. Like, we have been praying since the BJP came into power that someone would somehow be able to call the government to task for what they're doing, not only to Christians, but to other religious minorities in India. And we think you have the perfect test case. Like, you guys didn't do anything wrong. You did we had every document you could imagine that allowed us to live there, for Christo to practice there." And so I spent then the next 4 days meeting with the attorneys, like mapping out this legal strategy. Thankfully, because the deportation happened in Delhi, that created the situation where the case was at the level of the Delhi High Court, which is the 2nd highest court in India. So if we lost, we would still have the chance to appeal, but we didn't have to work our way through so many courts getting our way there. So I spent 4 days in Delhi talking with the attorneys, planning out the strategy, and then the kids and I went across India, did the craziest 5 days of packing up and saying goodbye to hundreds of people all at the same time. And then meanwhile, Christo had eventually made his way to Nepal, and you were just kind of running around going crazy. So eventually the kids and I crossed over land into Nepal and met up with Christo.
3 kids. and not knowing why the Lord had asked us to return back. So we came back. We had filed a case in India, which started in 2016. And meanwhile, we said, well, we don't know how long we're going to be back in the U.S. It could be a few months, a few years, forever. We don't know, because I don't know if I'm ever going to get permission to go back to India, or if I'll ever be able to challenge the government on this particular case. And so we said, well, at that point we had started the process of doing an adoption in India, but we didn't know if that could ever happen because we didn't know if it could go back. And so we said, well, the Lord has asked us to be obedient, and so if we can't do it there, at least we can start the process of potentially adopting from here in the U.S. And so actually, in July, we had, right before our anniversary, we went out for a retreat, and we did it on a very romantic. We sat there and filed all the papers to file our case in India, and the second was all the papers to file for adoption in the U.S. And so we mailed them off on the same day, and we said, Lord, we're starting these two big things. I have no idea what you're going to do with this.
We don't know which package.
Yeah. And we said, okay, we'll just leave it into the Lord's hands. And so we did. And the Lord answered on the adoption front first. So we filed in 2016 to adopt, and then in February of 2017 we got the call, and Melissa actually got the call at McDonald's, if you still remember it, because all the kids remember that call, and they said, CPS called us and said, hey, there's a group of 5 kiddos that need a home. Would you guys willing to take them? And there was Micah. Micah was one of the 5, and so we prayed about it, and we said, okay. Originally we had said 3 to 4. I mean, they said, one more, it can't be 8 to 4, right? So I said, okay, sure, we'll do 5. And then, so then in April of that year, 2017, Micah and Maya, our oldest 2, came to us, and they were separated in foster care. So about 2 months later, Caleb and Amelia joined our family, so that's the original 4. And then Priya was a long legal fight. The family that had her wanted to keep her, but just her and not the other 4 siblings. And we said, that's not right. And so we started another legal long case of challenging her ability to be able to be with her siblings, which took about 9 months. And at the end of that, the court ruled to have her join our family. So that's how we ended up with the original 5 plus 3, so 8. So we had 8. We still don't know anything about the case in India, although we kept having hearings. And after about a year and a half of hearings, we finally found out the Indian government had labeled me a national security threat. And so because of that, they said none of the charges against me could ever be disclosed because they were top secret. And I said, well, it's really hard for me to defend myself, and I don't even know what the charges against me are. And so went back and forth, and we just prayed. And then literally thousands of people around the world were praying for this case and asking for the Lord to work. And thankfully, the Lord kept, I think we had maybe 15 hearings or so before we finally were able to find the charges. And then at some point, I think in 2018 sometime, the government disclosed the charges against me, and they said it was because of the fact that I was a Christian working at a mission hospital, that they said that I was involved in religious conversion activities within India, and so because of that, it was illegal. Even though legally within India's constitution, I have every right to be able to practice my faith. And I said, and we asked them, look, is there any evidence that somebody's complained to you about it? And every local authority you talk to, they're like, no, Dr. Philip was great person to believe in. And if anybody was sick, they took care of them. So we didn't know what exactly the basic charges were. But
you weren't the only Christian doctor in India, right?
No. The problem was I was one of the few that was an American Indian that had gotten his U.S. citizenship and had now a dual citizenship in India. And so I was practicing under this dual citizenship license, which India allows you to do, but they weren't happy with the fact that I was a Christian working at this mission hospital. And there's a lot of things that changed in India. In 2013, a very powerful Hindu nationalist majority came into power. And as part of that goal, they had a whole team whose whole goal was to find Christians living in India that were not Indian citizens and trying to get them kicked out of the country. So once we found out we got kicked out, we were actually found out there were probably several thousand Christian workers in India that got kicked out around the same time as we did. But most of them didn't have ever an opportunity to challenge them because they didn't have any dual citizenship rights. I had dual citizenship rights, and so at least we could file a case. So anyway, when the court went, finally, the judge kind of saw through all this, or asked the government to show the charges and what evidence they had. And so they would never disclose the charges to me or what evidence they had, but they said, well, we will reveal them to the judge, and the judge can review it but they wouldn't let our attorneys look at it. So he looked through it, and it was interesting because, again, it's again the Lord's working, right? Our case got heard by actually a Hindu judge, but by God's grace, he was a just judge, and he read through the case, and then in January 2019, he ruled in my favor and overturned the government's decision to kick me out of the country, and said that what they did was illegal, and reaffirmed many of the fundamental rights under Article 25, which is part of the Indian Constitution, that says people have religious liberty and freedom. And not only that, they have the freedom to proselytize, to be able to explain their faith to people as part of their profession. Those are all guaranteed with the Indian Constitution. So when we finally won the case, it was a huge victory, not only for us, and but also for thousands of Christians across India that had been living in fear of not knowing could they actually even share their faith or live their faith out practically, because they didn't know what the government would do. And the High Court at that point essentially said, these are things that are guaranteed within our Constitution, so no government, including this government, can take those away because these are constitutional rights. So that was a huge, huge victory, and an amazing thing the Lord did. But while we were waiting for all this to happen, CPS called us again and said, hey, they've got another sister that was born. Do you want her too? So that was Gabby. And then while this case was going on in October 2019, right? No, October 2018, they called us again and said, hey, Nora is there. Do you want her too? And said, sure, we'll take her. So that's how we ended up with 10. So yeah. So then, in March of 2019, me and the older 3 kids went back to India to test the ruling, because the High Court's ruling was that not only do they have these rights, but then that my expulsion from India is annulled and that they should let me back in the country. So we wanted to see if that actually was true or not. So we went back, but before we went back, the one thing that had to be done, my name was on the blacklist in India, and me and my daughter had got Karna, who was here earlier, went down to the embassy in Houston and wanted to find out, like, can I even get permission to come back in the country? And so I didn't know who to talk to, so I just went up to the embassy and I said, here's the High Court ruling. It's like a 25-page document. Okay, this is. Would you talk to me? Of course, no one said anything. So me and my daughter went out for lunch, and then in the middle of the lunch, we get a call, and it's the consul general, which is like the person in charge of the embassy in Houston. He calls and he says, I need you to come into my office right now. And I said, oh my God. And we knew about this guy too. He was like on this hardline Hindu extremist guy, and from what we had heard about him, like not a nice man. So we went to his office. We're kind of trembling, like, oh my God, what is this man gonna do? I'm kind of thinking about the guy, the Turkish journalist that went in, what was it?
Like Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah. It was the Saudi journalist that was, And so I was like, oh my gosh, something terrible is gonna happen. So anyway, we go in, and the guy comes out and he's like, I want you to know that I'm really sorry for what we did to you. And I was like, who in the world would have thought this man would say that? And he apologized like 5 times to us over the conversation. He said, I'm really sorry, this is way overreaching of our authority. We should have never done this. But he said, the problem is, even though I agree that you have no right to go back, the only person that can get your name off the blacklist is the Joint Secretary for Foreign Affairs. And unless he takes your name off the blacklist, you'll never be allowed back in the country. And so he said, I think the only thing that I would encourage you to do is to have your lawyers contact or write them a letter and threaten them with, what is it called when contempt of court, and say that if you don't take me off the list, I'll take you to court, and you'll get potentially legal prosecution for it. So we sent a letter to this guy and said that our attorneys would file for contempt of court if they don't do that. Never heard back, and so me and the kids went back to India hoping that this guy will follow through. And we show up at the Delhi airport, and I scan my passport, and sure enough, all the lights go off again. And I said, no, it's deja vu. And so I'm talking to my daughter's on the phone with our attorneys, like, Dad's stuck again, something is wrong. And, again, this is how the Lord works. The attorney for the government who had represented the government's position, again, a very fundamentalist Hindu, over the course of 3 years and going through this case, the Lord had worked on his heart too. And at the end of the case, when we won the case, he actually told our Lord, he said, look, if anything ever happens to your client, if there's ever an issue, please have them contact my office and I will do what I can. So we got there and we were stuck again. And so we called our attorneys. He called this other attorney. And then he made a couple of phone calls, and they said, no, you have to let him go in. Otherwise, you guys will all be jailed, essentially, right? And so they said, okay. So I go my papers from the Supreme Court to the High Court, and it let me back in the country. So that was a huge blessing. So that's our story, and that's why we're back here in the U.S. is because, so we're kind of stuck here because now we have 10 kids. So it's a little harder to travel with 10 as opposed to 3. But if the Lord wills, we would still love to go back to India. We just don't know what the timing will be. Our kids have quite a bit of needs that we need to still meet. So, but we're glad for opportunities like this to be able to share how the Lord works. So I think that's my encouragement to you guys is that follow the Lord's calling in your life, but it doesn't always go the way that you expect it to go. But part of it is that's the walk of faith, right? It's trusting God even when nothing makes sense, right? Like I had no idea. At that point I had committed 17 years of my life to be able to go back to India and to work as a medical missionary there, and that's where I thought the Lord was leading me. And so when I got kicked out of the country, none of it made any sense at all. But now in retrospect, oh yeah, it makes very much sense why the Lord asked us to go through that. It was because he knew that we were the right people to go through this, because he knew that would then provide a deliverance for not only for us, but for thousands of other people and millions of Christians in India that were fearful for their lives, to be able to have the court say that they could practice their religion in freedom. And because of our case, that was one of the things that the Consul General from Houston said, is that I want you to know, he told me in Karna, that the 1,500 people that we kicked out of the country, I've taken all those people off the list now, so they can all return back. Wow. So because of that victory, all these people that lost their ability to be in India now have the ability to be able to go back. That was one part of that story that we didn't know was going to happen. The other part of it was that the day we were getting deported, our children, the ones we ended up adopting, were already in foster care at that point. And so the Lord knew that we had to come back so that our younger 7 kids could have a family. Again, not the way that we would have planned it or the way that we thought God would work, but God knew, and he cared about them just as much as he cared about us. And so he knew that if the right family was the only way to get him back to the U.S. was to kick him out of the country, he said, well, that's how I'm going to do it, So that I think that's kind of the amazing thing about God is that, when we walk through it, it's really hard, right? There were many months where I just sat and cried before him. I said, Lord, none of this makes any sense. Why are you asking us to go? This is so hard. It's so painful. But that's where faith comes in, right? It's just trust the Lord and ask him to guide you and give you wisdom, and to know that, in the end, he's got the better plan, right? We think we got everything figured out, but we don't, right? And so that's what we say, when he says that he is the author of your life, right? Is that he's the one that kind of is weaving these threads in and out of your life. So, sorry, that ended up being a longer testimony than expected, but yeah.